Hello, and welcome to today's edition of Let's Talk Competition. My name is Lewis Crofts. I'm a reporter with MLex, and I'll be moderating today. So, what are we talking about today? Well, take a deep breath. It's nothing bigger than the past and the future of European competition policy. It's a big year of change. The people are having their say through the European elections. EU heads of state are having their say, huddled around a table not far from here, picking the next generation of leaders. And governments are having their say, drawing up a list of policy priorities for the Commission and the EU institutions for the next 5 years. All this is taking place while there's still a war on European soil in Ukraine. The European Union is redrawing, recalibrating its trade relationship with China. There are elections in key trading partners such as the UK and the US. And all of this while the AI revolution is colliding with the workplace and how we do business, and will probably make panel moderators extinct by the end of the decade. For this big topic, European competition policy in the centre of all these swirling issues and buzzwords like resilience and autonomy and so forth, we have a very able panel. Today, I've got Olivier Guersent, Director General of DG Competition, Vanessa Turner, who is with BEUC, the EU Consumer Group, and also Natalie Harsdorf, who's Director General of the Austrian Competition Authority. So this is how it's going to work today. I'm going to put a few questions to them. We'll go through these big issues, Quo Vadis, competition policy, what it means for industry, what it means for consumers. And then I'm going to open up to you. This is Let's Talk Competition, and you're the other half of the debate. Now, what you do is you hold up your device to the screen, and there's a QR code, and that will take you through to slido.com. There you can put in your questions. I will fish them out later in the last third of the program and put them to the participants, and hopefully you'll get the answers you're wishing for. So, we're going to start with the big theme. I'm going to start with Olivier first. Olivier, I've just put competition policy into this massive year of change. It's on the lips of heads of state. It's on the lips of many politicians, former Italian politicians, particularly vocal at the moment. At the same time, it seems to be under quite a lot of pressure. Imagine you're a doctor, Dr. Guersent, diagnose the health of competition policy. Where are we at?
Well, I think competition policy, well, first of all, you can have as many competition policy as you wish, really. You have one competition law, and like any good standard of law, that allows you to conduct a number of different competition policies. And competition policy has been evolving over time here in Europe, but also in the US. I would say even more in the US. Think about the shifts in competition policy when you change administration. And it's still the same standard of law. I think it's important to keep in mind. And it's good because competition policy is not operating in the vacuum. It should adapt to economic realities. So what have we been doing over the last 5 years? Well, we've been trying to mainstream competition policy. What do I mean by that? Competition policy is not a goal in itself. It's not a goal to have competition. The goal is to have wealth, to enhance competitiveness, to enhance productivity. Competition policy or competition is a tool to that end. And mainstreaming means two things. That means, on the one hand, trying to help achieving broader overarching political goals like being more competitive, decarbonating our production process and being carbon neutral by 2050, managing successfully the digital revolution, etc., while keeping in mind the core of the mandate, which is to use the allocative efficiencies provided by markets. Markets are very inefficient in allocating our resources, but they're the most effective and efficient way to do it. Any other way have more pitfalls. I mean, if you try to select it politically, sometimes you'll be right, sometimes you will be wrong, but your ability to correct your choices will be much, much, much longer. And that's why in a market economy, we have competition and competition policy. That's also because we want to avoid excessive market power by biggest firms, because they can impose a private tax on consumers. So mainstreaming means this, and mainstreaming means also being capable to project competition values to help other policies to be more effective. A number of regulatory policies, for example, but also competition policy. I mean, I'm always amazed to see the opposition in the mouth of people between competition policy and industrial policy, and it's a recurring theme, every 30 years it comes back. But the truth is, they share exactly the same goal, enhancing long-term competitiveness. So a good industrial policy relies on competition process. I mean, an industrial policy that consists of politically selected winners never worked and would never work. So we need to combine the two together to be effective. Just a last word, because competition policy is very effective, but competition policy is the power to say no. And you can do many things with the power to say no, but you cannot do everything with the power to say no.
So do you think competition policy is more integrated than it used to be, or more conscious of those other policy goals?
Well, I think that the challenges of today, the fact that we need to adapt our way of producing, our way of consuming, our way of living at a pace that we never had before, calls for a better integration of all the instruments in the policy tool. And in that respect, I think it's important to distinguish policy from the competition trial. Because when it is about going after a firm for an infringement to competition policy, well, then it's not political, well, it's not even policy. It's a fair trial under the control of a judge. And there your margin is not that big. But when it is about defining a policy, then you have quite a bit of margin.
Vanessa, just to turn to you, historically, competition policy has been based on consumer interest, consumer welfare, well-being. It goes under many different titles, but it's basically serving consumers. Even now, the Commission talks about making markets work for people. But with these swirling other interests around industrial policy, integrating competition policy into the broader mix, that potentially puts consumer interest in conflict with other interests, resilience or scale, innovation, whatever. The consumer interest might be aligned with those, but it might not be. Do you ever worry that the consumer interest might lose out to some of these other priorities?
Yes, I do. Maybe taking a step back, I think consumers' well-being should be at the core of competition policy because that's where it comes down to ultimately. But I'm not sure it's even always been the case when I think maybe about how long it takes to bring an antitrust case. And when decisions are eventually adopted, the remedies don't always bring concrete results for consumers. So I sometimes have my doubts about competition law always prioritising the well-being of consumers. And when I look at concentration levels, for example, in some consumer-facing markets like digital or telecoms, I wonder if we haven't inadvertently served the interests of big business more than consumers in merger control, particularly when we see that in some concentrated markets, companies are making record profits, big tech being a prime example. But I think there are also other areas that are very important for consumers that we need to look at in terms of concentrated sectors with high profitability and those sectors that haven't received the same amount of focus as, say, digital. And that's, for example, the agri-food supply chain. That large profitability in that sector is particularly inappropriate in times of cost of living crisis, which we are living through and are very serious and may be leading to some of the issues that we're seeing in the political context. So I'm not sure that we're looking at mergers in the right way in the agri-food sector yet. But having said all that, I do think that competition policy has served consumers well in more recent years, and I've seen positive changes in terms of the Commission and the Member States' enforcement in the digital sector, thinking about mergers, Amazon iRobot, Booking, eTravel. I think they're really good. And also then coming back to my food sector point, the very recent Mondelez antitrust decision, that was a very nice focus of competition law on the food sector, which is very promising, I think. But then coming to your kind of bigger point and what Olivier was already saying, I do see that in the context of recent election results, geopolitics, all the points that you mentioned, that there is a risk that other interests will take precedence over consumers' well-being. And we've seen before, as you said, calls for industrial policy and European champions, and the Commission and Executive Vice President Vestager have boldly and wisely resisted bad competition policy in the way that Olivier defined it. But I feel there is going to be quite a lot of pressure this time on competition policy. I mean, we clearly do need to improve European competitiveness, but I think that it's competition that drives competitiveness and protects consumers. So I think it would be unfortunate if we allowed more market concentration rather than more competition. So I sincerely hope that the Commission and the national competition authorities, while recognising and acknowledging today's challenges in the global context, can find a way to preserve the heart of competition policy and its values, as Olivier said. I think it's essential that the Commission carries on and the national competitions carry on their good work to protect consumer well-being, but also a well-functioning European economy.
Well, let's take some of those points and, Natalie, put them to you. You're a national enforcer on the ground. You hear what's going on in Brussels and these big debates about the future and the soul and the heart of competition enforcement, the direction, China, competitiveness and so forth. At the same time, you serve your citizens and constituents on the ground who are facing higher prices for their food, utilities, may not have access to transport or public transport or healthcare. You have a very obvious job on the ground to deal with. Squeezed between these two debates. Now, what's your guiding principle? What's your North Star in that? How do you marry the two, what you hear in Brussels and what you face at home?
Yeah, thanks for that, Louis. So we've just celebrated 20 years of European Competition Network. I myself have been in competition enforcement since 2009, so I've experienced firsthand, also in a leadership position, how many challenges we have faced as enforcers in Europe the past years. Digitalization, the call to include sustainability, considerations, but foremost also COVID and the war in Ukraine. And our response has been swift and coordinated. We published position papers on competition enforcement in view of COVID, in view of the war in Ukraine. We have worked with the Commission on the horizontal guidelines, how to include sustainability issues. Authorities like from the Netherlands or Greece and also Austria, we published guidelines on sustainability. So I would say that we do a great job at coordinating. It's a great success. And also, I don't feel like I'm being pulled into different directions. I rather feel that we have a strong coordinated leadership within the network. And I think one basis for that, for us to be leaders, independent leaders, is of course the ECM Plus directive, which allows us to act a bit further away from political day-by-day considerations. At the same time, I think full accountability is important. On Wednesday, I'm being invited to my national parliament, and I'll answer every question that parliamentarians ask to me from opposition and government. And I think this exchange with the elected representatives of the people is crucial. So we're working close to the pulse of economy and consumers, and also the democratically elected representatives. At the same time, we have to keep some equidistance when we do our jobs. And when you look at the results of the national enforcers in areas where maybe the Commission has other priorities because they have to look at cases that are European-wide, look at the fight against bid rigging. We have saved, as national authorities, taxpayers' money, hundreds of millions of euros. We have enforced in areas that are very important to consumers, like the food sector, already mentioned by Vanessa, very important, energy sector, transport. So I think in combination, we have shown a lot of strength. And I can also speak for Austria. We have never received more complaints by companies and also consumers, and I don't see this in a negative way. It rather shows that there's a lot of trust in my agency that we can do something, that we can deliver. So that's also an opportunity. And I'm happy that on Wednesday, when I report to Parliament, I can also say that our numbers have increased. So last year, we brought almost 100% more cases before the court than in every other year since the existence of the agency. So we need more of an effort and not less.
Olivier, just come to you. Do you think enough people speak up for competition policy? You do. It's your job. You're touring the TV studios of Europe and the US. You've got Vanessa, who supports the Commission most of the time in its cases.
All the time.
but it sometimes seems like everything that you hear out there is trying to eat away or dent or somehow push competition policy into a place where you might not want it to go. Do you think that there's enough people talking up for it?
There's never enough. But to be frank, I'm quite pleased. You know, an anecdote. Some years ago, I was just in the job for barely 18 months, and we got a letter from 4 ministers. Mr. Altmaier, Mr. Le Maire, the Italian minister at the time, and the Polish one, calling for a reform of merger review in order to allow more European champions. And of course, the only reason why such a reform would be needed is if you want these European champions to be shielded from competition in the European domestic market. Otherwise, you don't need to reform anything. I mean, we have a number of European champions. None of them was prevented from existing by competition policy. I was very reassured that less than a week after, we got a letter by 16 ministers of 16 other member states saying, well, please don't do what they ask you to do. When I read the report of Mr. Letta, it is clear that he believes that there will not be a functioning single market without effective competition. And effective competition only happens if it's policed, so if you have an effective competition enforcement. When I listened to the latest speech of Mr. Draghi, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, what he says is we need a competition policy that allows companies to gain critical mass, because we're in a world in which you need more investment, you need to have global size, etc., while safeguarding competition in the domestic market. Well, this is precisely what we're trying to do, and I have to say what in 99% of the cases we managed to do, because remember, when it comes to merger control, which is pretty much what is at the center of the conversation, prohibition happens in far less than 1% of the cases.
Let's take some of those points on merger control and also Vanessa's concerns about concentration. And Natalie, I come to you. If I was to make a caricature of the debate at the moment, it's for merger control, be harder on the tech companies merging and be softer on the European industrialists who want to merge. You've got an active merger control regime. You take a lot of decisions, go to court. You also send a lot up to Brussels, or a fair amount up to Brussels. Do you think that merger control has shifted in the last 5 or 10 years in Europe because of these pressures? Do you think it should shift further?
Thanks. I'm happy to give my perspective. So Austria introduced quite late a modern competition regime. So modern competition law was adopted in 2005. Many of the structural problems we still see on the market, they are also a result of a lack of merger control. And a recent economic study in Austria shows that concentration levels have risen, and it's a big concern for us. And our government actually decided to empower us now to do a more structured monitoring of concentration levels and how competition is evolving on the market. At the same time, I see other governments in Europe adopting legislation allowing competition authorities to take even structural remedies as a follow-up to a sector inquiry. If you put that into perspective with effective merger control, it seems much less invasive, I would say, than taking remedies after a sector inquiry. And you can actually in advance make sure that those competition concerns don't arise. So I think any calls for clearing anti-competitive mergers, and let's be clear, we're talking about anti-competitive mergers, which are quite few actually, then we have to be clear that this brings a big risk. And also if we look at jurisdictions that allow for like a political clearance process, let's call it like that, for mergers, let's look what happened in Germany, for example, food retail sector, where my German colleagues were very critical, and then it was cleared. The results could be seen for the consumers on the market. And also one word on like telecoms maybe. In Austria in 2012 we had telecom merger, one at the European level, one at the national level. We had great concerns about both, and they were both cleared, albeit at the European level, with remedies. And unfortunately, in our ex post evaluation, all the concerns we had materialized. So let's look at the lessons of the past, and let's not make these mistakes for the future. And I think sometimes pinning the lack of achievement in other areas of policy on merger control may be tempting, but it's not really evidence-based in my view. So let's keep that in mind and have in mind possible negative effects for consumers, but also businesses. Like in merger control, it's usually SMEs that get back to us and tell us, be careful, we have concerns. We have concerns about this merger. So let's look at the structure of the economy as a whole and what effects there might be for the overall economy, even if maybe those not so big players don't have such a strong voice. It's our job as competition authorities to reach out of them and to hear them.
Olivier, just to take that back to you, I mean, the message there is let's not compromise on the current standards of merger review, merger enforcement, and yet the calls for competitiveness stroke industrial policy are louder than ever. The Commission's responded to that by reforming state aid law, by adopting these cross-border state aid projects, IPCEIs. You've addressed or partially addressed the Chinese competition problem through the foreign subsidies regulation, and yet the clarion calls for competitiveness are louder than ever. Why is that, and what more do you need to do?
Well, I think there is a very simple explanation to this. Innovation is more important than ever. I mean, we are in a world in which things change at a pace it never changed before. And we find it extremely challenging to adapt. Probably more here in Europe, where we have, a more structured, way of doing things, way of financing our social model, et cetera, than elsewhere. But the truth is, so we need to adapt. Nobody believes we will manage to be more competitive in 30 years from now if we're not decarbonated, if we are not managed, or digital transition, etc., and more resilient as well, by the way. So all this is aspects of a single problem, but it requires a very, very deep change. And I think it's easy to think that if you just can turn a bit the screw of competition policy, you will fix that. But you won't. It's just like thinking that, the tail moves the dog. So what you need is really to seriously look at the framework condition for competitiveness. Competitiveness comes from having the right framework conditions. And then, of course, competition policy can give the finishing touch by making competition effectively work, and therefore allocative efficiencies by market working better in the interest of the consumers, but not only the consumers. Actually, if you look at it, all those that call for shielded from competition industrial champions in Europe, what does that mean? Well, that means that you can exploit market power in Europe, increase markups and prices, decrease quality, have a lower quality of service. Who will suffer from that? Of course, consumers, but more than consumers. The 99.9% of our companies that are SMEs, because they are subcontractors of these big groups. They are clients of these big groups. Their competitiveness depends on how good the quality of service or quality of good they can obtain from these big groups. When I'm told, you should allow in-market consolidation for telecom operators, we know what will happen. That's actually the reason why they admitted themselves they want this, is that could lead to increases in prices of up to 20%. All right. Who will suffer? Consumers, me, you, of course. But all the companies that need to get access to cheap and good quality connectivity for their competitiveness. So it's such a short-term calculation. So what we need to do is finally be serious with the deep reforms we need to make to have the right framework conditions, because not having the right framework conditions is very expensive. One of the reasons why we have to give so many state aids, which, by the way, we can barely afford from a fiscal position point of view, is to compensate for the fact that we do not have the right framework conditions. There are reasons why chips companies do not establish in Europe if they're not subsidized. And a number of other examples. We don't have enough engineers. We probably don't have the right tax regime. The cost of failure, if you go to disruptive innovators, is far too heavy in Europe. So, and if you want to compensate for this, you need to subsidize it. And this is what we're doing. But it's a relatively ineffective and very costly way of fixing a problem because you don't want or cannot tackle it at the root.
Vanessa, just to come to you on that, I mean, there's clearly massive shifts going along in the economy. The companies are being asked to make big changes. Olivier talked about state aid, subsidising the green transition. Shouldn't consumers share in the cost of this? Shouldn't they? I mean, we're sharing, I suppose, in that this is state aid, which is our taxpayers' money in the first place, but also the companies need to be incentivised to move, or they should move, be it collectively as a group to get smaller packages for our detergent or for more efficient ways to produce concrete or something. Shouldn't consumers acknowledge that they're part of this shift as well and they should share in some of the costs?
Yes, I think consumers should be prepared to share in the cost of the green transition, but I think the key is that they should only bear a fair share of that transition. So they shouldn't be the only ones bearing the burden. And we've mentioned already the horizontal guidelines. I think actually those horizontal guidelines on cooperations between competitors come out in more or less the right place in terms of giving flexibility to businesses to move towards a green transition, but still ensuring the safeguards for consumers. So I think that's pretty good at the European level, but equally at the member state level, we're pretty much in the right place on that. What I'd be really interested in, though, is having been given this new flexibility by the guidelines and also the procedures and practices of the competition authorities, how many companies who have previously argued that the competition law was stopping them from going green, how many are now actually making use of that flexibility in order to reduce their environmental footprint? I think that would be an interesting question.
Well, let's ask Olivier. Let's ask Natalie. How many companies come to your doors? Let's start with you, Olivier. How many companies come to your door asking for help in finding some wiggle room in the law to be able to do the things they want to do?
Well, interestingly, zero. Margaret Vestager has made a first call saying, well, if you need to team up involving some restriction of competition in order to get some tangible environmental benefits, come and see us. And if really you have to, I mean, the restriction of competition are inevitable to get the result, and the result is tangible, we will clear that. Zero is the answer.
Natalie, I mean, I've seen in countries like Germany, they allow, the car industry or retailers to, particularly during COVID, but even post-COVID, to group together to help us, society, make these big shifts. Do people come on and knock on your door?
So in Austria, the legislation allows probably the biggest scope for allowing a sustainability defense, and based on that we produced guidelines, which I think though are very much in tune with the Commission's work. And we've had some consultations, but nobody running towards our doors. So I think it's also an example where maybe before the law was adopted, before the guidelines were published, maybe the idea was that the problem was bigger than it was. I still think it's a good step to have a clear legal basis, and we're prepared for the future. But the need doesn't seem so much to be there. And just to share an anecdote, sometimes I like to test competition policy questions with my students at the university, and I ask them sustainability defense or greenwashing, and although they're very much pro-sustainability, the majority saw a big risk of greenwashing. So that's the voice from the youth.
Okay. Moving down the sort of chain of command, we've talked about the industry and to consumers now. Vanessa, consumers argue we've had a pretty good last decade or so of competition enforcement or competition policy. There's the damages directive, good for consumers, and also litigant law firms. Then you've got collective redress mechanisms, which are taking root in Europe. The European Commission is starting to run more exploitative abuses, which are good for consumers. Arguably, the last 5 years, 10 years of digital debate is about consumers and what access to what services we have on our apps at what cost. But do you think that the consumer interest is going to be the same for the next mandate? Do you think it will shift to more real economy areas? And crucially, when it does that, do you think the Commission or indeed national enforcers need new tools to do that?
All very interesting questions. I think the current political developments show that people are not feeling very happy at the moment. And obviously competition law can't fix that, but that does raise the question, as you rightly do, to see if what can be done from the consumer perspective very concretely to make people see the value of competition, make citizens and consumers see the value of competition. And I think one of the key things would be, as you were suggesting, a more direct focus on the areas that matter the most to consumers. Food, we've already discussed, utility bills, energy, Natalie already mentioned, but also other areas that maybe have had less focus and affordable care. And I will come back to exactly how I think we might be able to tackle that in terms of the new tools that you mentioned. Because it's true, there has been some good focus, exploitative cases and the like, but I would say that for competition, the advantages of competition law to be really felt more directly by consumers, there are a number of things that we should do and can do by way of tools. So I'll give you maybe three that I would prioritise. First of all, consumers very rarely get any compensation for competition law violations. You mentioned lawyers, but consumers are not seeing a lot. And one of the reasons for that is there's no provision in EU competition law for collective redress actions. It's not in the Damages Directive, it's not in the Representative Actions Directive, which does, however, allow consumers to enforce the law in other areas, including the DMA, but we don't have that for competition law. So when companies break the law, consumers getting some sort of redress just doesn't happen. But I can see three ways that could improve that. The first, Representative Actions Directive already mentioned. We could add competition law to that, perhaps through any revision of Regulation 1, if that is going to take place. Or we can amend the Damages Directive to allow collective redress actions in all member states in the way that some member states have them today. But I think that's not the only way. We can also look at other possible solutions more dependent on the Commission or the national competition authorities, in that Commission or other regulator decisions could include some form of compensation for consumers, as actually is done elsewhere and was done by the Commission in some past cases. For example, including some form of compensation in settlement or commitments decisions, or perhaps going down the German model of disgorgement. That would be another thing that one could think about. And then at the national level, my wish list would include member states looking at the Portuguese model of financing consumer protection projects, including competition law, by paying a percentage of the fines imposed by national competition authorities into an independent fund, which could then fund competition and other consumer protection projects. Now, obviously, that's not damages as such, but it would go at least some way to restoring some remedy to consumers who have been harmed by other violation. So that would be my sort of first area. The second area, and I think this has also come up in the questions I can see on Slido, I think one really useful tool for the future, and I think Natalie's already hinted at it, would be to have what we called previously new competition tool or market investigation tool. And that tool is being looked at by a number of member states. Some have recently introduced it, Germany, Denmark, Italy, and others are looking at it. If we don't have that tool at the European level, I think that could risk fragmentation in the single market, which is not ideal for the reasons we've already discussed. And it would also lead to some member states serving consumers better than others. And I think, then coming back to the sectors again, that tool could enable the Commission to deal with a number of structural problems that we're seeing in markets that matter to consumers. And one example of this would be back in the food sector or basic consumer goods sector, territorial supply constraints, where we've seen from the Mondelez case, for example, that this has led to higher prices in some member states by up to 40%. Now, that should not be happening in a single market because of the division of the market. The single market can't just be for the benefit of companies, but should also be for consumers. And then one last one, if I may, on the national level, and I think this is an important one that has not been looked at as widely, perhaps, as the other points that I just mentioned. But at the national level, where these powers don't already exist, I think some kind of call-in power for mergers that currently fly below the radar would be important to deal with things like private equity roll-up transactions. For example, in Finland and the UK, these have been identified to raise serious concerns in healthcare and veterinary care, respectively, and those are things that really matter to consumers. It matters, but at the moment, competition law, even at the national level, is having a hard time dealing with some of them because they fly below the radar. And this, I think, is a serious issue when consumer surveys, a consumer survey recently has shown, for example, that in Italy, more than half of the people questioned said that they had difficulty affording to go to the doctor or the dentist. So that is something that is real, tangible benefit. So I think there's some things that could be done, even if we've come a good way, both to the credibility, for the benefit of consumers and for the credibility of competition law in these current difficult times.
Thanks, Vanessa. Let's rattle through the wish list then. Natalie, you're first up. Sector inquiries, I mean, you've got powers, you use them already, looking into foods and so forth. Do you think those powers should be enhanced either at national level or European level? Second one, disgorgement. Is that a possibility under Austrian law? What would it take to do that?
I think maybe I would like to touch upon one issue Vanessa mentioned is prioritization. That's a power we all have, also thanks to the ECM Plus directive. And I think prioritizing the right cases is very important to do our job in a way that it benefits consumers. And most of the consumer complaints we get are on food prices, energy prices, health, transport. I think those are areas, particularly national authorities, should focus on. So prioritization is very important, but also communicating, I think, what we do then back to our citizens, because sometimes they feel markets don't work for them. And it's very important also to show good examples where we make the markets work for our citizens and we deliver and then also talk about it. I think that's important also in terms of legitimacy. And the second point is good timelines in sector inquiries. I think that's very important. So a few authorities and also my authority, we've managed to do sector inquiries within a very short period of time. 3 months for the gasoline sector inquiry, 1 year on food. We just need to stand up here and be quick, because otherwise our results will not be relevant for policymakers. We just have to be quicker. It's just the time. We have to pull our resources together. And we have had good experiences with our recommendations in the sector inquiries being followed up by legislators. Then, of course, in some member states, the legislator went even further now and allows for remedies to be imposed after sector inquiry. That's certainly something that should be seriously discussed across Europe. It would enhance the toolbox, but I think resources are very important to get the timelines right. Foremost, we have to be quick and we have to be correct. In the end, our results have to be correct. And that is true for sector inquiries. It's also true for mergers and other cases. The results have to be correct, and we have to make the cases work in the end to bring benefits to the consumers. And I mean, some agencies are even closer to the consumer because they also have consumer protection powers. We have a power in terms of fighting against unfair trading practices, which also has a spillover effect in the end on the consumer very often. So it's also an area where we enforce a lot. I think if I can add to the wish list, I think we need to get have the resources across Europe that we can step up our investigations in terms of digitalization. So some authorities with more resources, they're able to create departments for data analysis, AI. I've created a department with the resources that I got from the government, but not all agencies are able to do that. So I think here we need to step up in the investigation. So that's an add-on to the already long wish list. from Vanessa. So overall, yeah, looking at our toolbox, strengthening it, but also making the best use of what we have. And for that, we need support by our governments, by our policymakers, so we get the resources to do that.
I'm going to take what you said, and I'm going to move smoothly into the Slido section. So for the people at home, put your questions in. We'll take the top question, which refers exactly what you two have been talking about, which is what new regulatory tools you wish the new Commission would develop to address contemporary challenges in competition policy, by Carol. Thank you very much, Carol. So Olivier, a new competition tool. I know you're a fan of that. Perhaps disappointed that you didn't get it in the last cycle. Would that be on your wish list for the next mandate? Also, the points on call-in power for roll-up transactions and disgorgement, if you could address that.
Well, let's start with calling power. I mean, calling power can be. We are waiting the ruling of the Court of Justice in the Article 22 case, so we shall see. I hope we will win it. One way to help the situation, if we wouldn't, would indeed be that the colleagues national competition authorities have massively call-in powers, because that would also fix the issue at the root. So it's not really a new power for the Commission, it's indirectly. Secondly,
you could recommend that if you felt that Article 22 case.
Well, we actively. Well, they don't need us to recommend it. But that's the opportunity for me to say that the way competition authorities are working together in Europe has massively evolved over the last 20 years. In the beginning, it was very much the heritage of the Commission monopoly of exemption, and so it's the Commission telling the member states what to do. Today, it's nothing to do with this. I mean, it's a collectivity of 28 competition authorities that have joint ownership of the enforcement of competition rules in Europe. So, for example, Vanessa was mentioning the horizontal guidelines. The horizontal guidelines, they're Commission guidelines, but they've been discussed and negotiated for more than a year among ourselves, and we issued them only when we agreed. Of course, the Commission could have adopted it, but I'm not interested in having Commission guidelines that the colleagues in the member states kind of have to follow, but they're not convinced. Because what we are interested in is having not only the right policy enforcement policy in Europe, but also that it is homogeneous, that it means the same thing from Helsinki to Madrid. And for this, you need to have buy-in, and to have buy-in, you need to do it together. Now, on the new competition tool, you said I'm a fan. I have a bit mixed feelings. And for one reason is, I have had the pleasure of being equipped with two new tools recently. Digital Market Act, very important. Foreign subsidy regulation, very important too. The Council and the Parliament, so the co-legislators in their wisdom, decided on staffing, and none of this staffing came. And that's a general problem in the Commission. So if I inherit a new competition tool without the staffing, I'd rather not have it. And the reason for this is that the new competition tool is very interesting but what is it about? It is about finding inefficiencies in market functioning in the absence of a clear infringement to competition rules. So, and you try to fix it so it has a lot to do with the philosophy, as I described it previously, of competition policy, which is about allowing the markets to perform optimally their allocative function, but you do not have an infringement. And I can see where it exists, that the appetite of the political class for, you should look at this, you should look at that, you should fix this and that, is huge. If you do not have extra resources, these resources would have to be taken out of actual enforcement against actual infringements of competition law, where actual consumers suffer. And I'm not sure this is what we should do. So a new competition tool would be perfect if it comes with resources, point one. Point two, I think it's Vanessa that made the point, and it's a very good point, in a world in which more and more national competition authority will be equipped with this, the risk that they use it in the same sectors, but in different ways, is not zero. And in that case, that could have a potential for fragmenting the single market and therefore affecting our competitiveness. And in these cases, at least, I think the Commission should have the possibility to say, well, hold on, you have 3 or 4 or 5 to study the same thing. Let's study it together with a single decision of the Commission, as is the case currently, for example, in abuses of dominant position. So that would be necessary. And the last point is, of course, level playing field. I mean, all of this we're doing to guarantee a level playing field. So that's the foreign subsidy regulation is about that as well. And new competition tool, in my view, should and would also have a kind of external dimension.
It's interesting because the German proposal for a new competition tool has that external dimension. It also is sector specific, or it's recommended for certain areas like raw materials, areas of, I think it's sort of strategic importance. I'm just going to sort of mix it in with the next question here, which are what are your views on the Franco-German declaration calling for consolidation in key sectors? Here's airspace, mobile network, and so forth. What's your feeling on a sector-specific approach to the NCT, or indeed here, consolidation? I mean, the NCT was always agnostic on an industry level.
I wouldn't be in favor of specializing the instrument. Of course, when you design your enforcement policy, you see that there are problems that are more pressing in some sectors than in others. So you will kind of specialize your priorities in a way. But say we miss a sector that happens to be important in 2 years' time. Things are going very quick these days. What do? You embark again for 18 months in the Council of Parliament to change the law. So I think if you have a tool like this, it's by definition generic. And then the Commission should have guidelines that explains which are its priorities in terms of enforcing, but these priorities should be able to change, because otherwise it will not be future-proof. So that, I think, would be my answer to this.
Thank you. We'll take the next question. This is from Anonymous, working hard at the keyboard. Competition has been much politicised during the last elections, often for the worse. How can public awareness of competition be improved to get greater support? Maybe Vanessa, to you.
I think actually Natalie's already touched on it. I think better communication at the national level probably is easier than from the Commission to the entire EU. So I think there is a big role to be played by the national competition authorities in explaining the benefits of competition, and it will be easier to do if the cases that are brought are in areas, as you said, that are specifically or directly relevant to consumers. And I think the same actually goes for the DMA. I think the national competition authorities can have a role there to also explain the benefits of the DMA to consumers. So that may be one of the main ways. Obviously, as consumer organisations, we do the same. We and our members work on this as well. But to have the support of the national authorities would be great.
Natalie, maybe I'll put that to you with a slight twist on it. Here is the national authority should communicate to the consumers. That's all good. Do you think there's communication to the politicians as well? I mean, often the politicians are the first ones to shout, Natalie, please can you solve this problem? And it might not actually be your problem. It might be a much more complicated series of issues and economic forces, and it's not really a competition problem. Do you think that there's a communication need also not down to the consumers, but also up to the politicians?
Yeah, I think you can absolutely look at two distinct things. One is like I take my decisions in an independent way from any political influence. That's important. But on the other hand, keeping an open door for discussions, and we have to work at the pulse of economy, of citizens, of legislators. So keep an open communication channel with stakeholders. That's very important. And I see very often that we as national authorities are much closer to our parliaments, to our policymakers, than maybe at the European level, or it's even enshrined in our laws. Like for me, that I give a yearly report. There's a clear basis for that work. But advocacy is really important. It's important to have a voice. Also, in legislation, for example, we give opinions in upcoming legislation, but it can also be a good investigative tool, because we sometimes base investigations on hints we get over whistleblowing we get from consumers or smaller companies. So it also works if you're there and people are aware that you're there. It can help and enhance your investigations. So I think there's a direct benefit also as an investigator.
Let's take another one. Let's move on to the ineluctable draw of the digital sector, which we've been avoiding to date. This is Alex. Thanks, Alex. The last mandate has seen very few antitrust cases outside of the tech sector, although Mondelez has just been mentioned.
And it's not the only one.
Now that you have the DMA, will antitrust enforcement at the Commission level die?
Oh la la. No, Alex, be reassured. First of all, it's not exactly true. Very few is, I think, a bit of an exaggeration. It's certainly not true in cartels. Although, arguably, over the last 2 years, the number of cartel decisions has been dropping. And I have a scoop for you, it will continue to drop next year. And because we are in the transition, when I took over in 2020, the Commission had been relying for the previous 10 years exclusively on leniency applications. Of course, when you rely exclusively on leniency application, always the same thing happened. At some time, people start to wonder, why should I confess if I have 0 chances to be detected? And then you stop confessing. So I appointed a new director for cartels, Mrs. Jasper, with only one clear mission, which was to rebuild the pipeline, which has been doing. And we have moved from a pipeline composed of 90% of immunity cases to a pipeline that is kind of 50-50, ex officio versus leniency. And guess what? The number of leniency applications went up again. So be reassured, Alex. I think not only will not mean less antitrust enforcement, but it will not even mean less antitrust enforcement in tech. And if I can take 2 minutes to explain that, this is simply because the GAFAs and the gatekeepers of all kinds, GAFAs or not, will adapt. They're actually currently adapting. They will change their business model in order to try to continue to leverage their market power, but in a way that is not directly infringing the DMA. And that, in my view, will open all sorts of new perspective for antitrust enforcement in tech as well.
Take the next one, which is referring to something that Vanessa said earlier about territorial supply constraints. So beyond territorial supply constraints by manufacturers, do competition authorities plan to address the exploitative pricing strategies of supermarkets? Natalie, you've taken on, well, he's taking on Apple, you're taking on apples in Austria.
Yes, indeed. So we have a case pending at court, which is about unfair trading practices towards apple farmers, and I think it's a very good precedent for unfair trading practices in the agricultural sector. But more than that, we conducted a huge sector inquiry into the food sector. We did it within a year and published the results last autumn. And one of the main takeaways was that we saw that the price differences between Austria and Germany on the same products very often are due to differences in the prices given to the retail chain. So they get a different price for the Austrian market than for the German market. And we submitted those results to the European Commission, and I think it's been one element that has also supported the Commission's investigations and actions, which are extremely important, and we continue to support that the Commission takes action in that area. As Vanessa said, it's so important that the consumers see that we can make the single market work for them, and it's not understandable for a consumer why they should pay a different price for the same product if they are 5 kilometers from the German border and then they cross the border and pay much less. So it's an area where I think we really have to look into it. And I think this should be on the priorities list of the next Commission, certainly. So we will flag it for sure.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on to the next question. This is to you, Vanessa. This is from Andras. The Collective Redress Directive is limited to representative actions. Would you consider the introduction of opt-out claims useful? Is that the distant sound of ambulance chasers, or no?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think, well, it's primarily a question for national procedural law, but from the consumer perspective, it is not always easy to bring an opt-in case. So I can see some merit in opt-out, but I wouldn't like us to tip over into ambulance chasing. Nevertheless, we do need to look at the processes to be able to bring successful consumer claims that actually benefit consumers and not just the lawyers.
So the next one on Article 102. So I think the first of these episodes was about 102, and the Commission announced it was going to move its guidance to guidelines. The question is, when will they be published?
Probably in 2025. But
maybe a draft sooner for review?
Well, as usual, draft for reviews, maybe before the end of 24. Maybe not. The bit depends, I mean, of also the timing for the new commission. Because at some point I'd like my new commissioner to have the time to think and endorse the policy orientations. Although, to be fair, the guidelines will be about a specific category of abuse. We will not touch immediately exploitative abuses. I think we should do it a second time, but it's more challenging, obviously. But for the time being, what we will do is we will codify the decision practice and the case law of the court ever since 2008 when we had the guidance paper. So in a way, it's an exercise of transparency and also how the light of the past can cast a light on the future and on our enforcement priorities. But I don't think the question was talking about what needs to be fixed in 102. I don't think anything needs to be fixed in 102. I think 102 works well. I think the policy developments in the last 15 years were very positive. The move towards a standard of potentiality of effect was exactly what we wanted and is very welcome. So now we need to consolidate all this in order to be able to continue further on the same line.
Thanks. We'll take another one. Vanessa, this one's for you. Where do you draw the line between competition policy and market regulation? Now, I asked this because you mentioned territorial supply restrictions, which there's been a competition policy decision very recently on such things, but at the same time, some organisations would like to see a more regulatory ban on it. Do you think that that would help?
I mean, we have many sectors where we have both regulation and competition policy, and they're actually complementary. If we think about energy, telecoms, digital now. But I can also think of sectors where regulation is not happening to the disadvantage of consumers, where the Commission has taken decisions, and outside of the digital sector, the Renfe case on rail ticketing. I mean, if we could fix that with regulation, great. We haven't yet fixed it. I hope we will. But in the meantime, competition can do something. So I see them as complementary and not kind of mutually exclusive at all. And if we can't get regulation, at least we do still have the competition law tool, which can benefit consumers if it's used.
Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, I'm going to take the final question because the clock is ticking, and it's a big one. So you've got 20 seconds each. How can we be a competitive force in global markets while enforcing our current competition rules? What do we need to change to be part of the global game? Natalie.
We should further strengthen what we do in terms of achieving an international level playing field. We already do a lot of technical assistance, national authorities, also the Commission in many regions of the world. Next week we'll be discussing competition policy at the UN in Geneva. I think that's an important part of our work, and we should strengthen our efforts there.
Vanessa?
I'm not sure we need to change a whole amount. I think we need to preserve the best of what we have and then do the various things that I've already mentioned on my wish list. I mean, I think if we have effective competition in Europe, I think that's the best recipe for being a competitive force in global markets.
Olivier, final word?
We are a competitive force in the world. We are by far bigger in trade terms than either the Americans or China. And people have to realize that. And if we want, of course, we need to be even better. We need to be better in innovation, in scaling up, etc. Unfortunately, it's a bit deeper than competition policy, as I tried to explain previously. It has to do with framework conditions here. It has to do with education, skilling, reskilling, tax systems, market, the way financial market works, and allow you to take the capital that is necessary to grow, etc., etc. And competition policy, of course, can be there to give the finishing touch in terms of being able to make bankable projects that were not by de-risking it through state aid or gain global size in exchange with usually modest concessions on the domestic market so that you do not exploit consumers in Europe, but you still can gain global size. But that's really where we intervene. The basic conditions for competitiveness are elsewhere.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, the time's up. It's for me to close this. I'd like to thank you at home for sending in your questions. Alex, Andras, special shout out to you.
Anonymous.
And Anonymous, who's been working very hard at the keyboard. I'd also like to thank the panel members for your answers. If your question didn't get asked, then that's my fault. If it didn't get answered, then it's their fault. I'd like to ask you to also stay tuned to DG Competition's website for further episodes of the Let's Talk Competition series. And in the meantime, have a nice day and thanks for watching.